How I used GPT-O1 Pro to diagnose my autoimmune disease after spending $100,000 and visiting over 30 hospitals in vain. Okay, this isn't the kind of story you'd share at family gatherings, but it literally saved my life, so here it goes. It all started 3 years ago when I first felt a strange tingling sensation in my legs. Nothing major, I thought at the time. Just from sitting too long at my laptop, I told myself. But a couple of months later, the tingling turned into burning, then came the weakness, and after that, complete chaos. I visited 32 clinics, from Chicago to Houston, New York, to some godforsaken little town in Wisconsin, where one doctor swore he'd seen something like this once back in the 90s. Every doctor confidently had a different explanation. Anything from, it's all just stress, relax, to, maybe it's a rare form of diabetes, let's run some tests. I ended up spending more on tests than I did on my first car. Even worse, every time I thought I was close to an answer, the doctors would back off. Your autoimmune test results are negative, they'd say with genuine sympathy, as if that was the end of the story. No one could explain why I was literally dying from the inside out. I started to feel scared. Not of dying, though let's be honest, that crossed my mind too. But of never finding out what was happening to me. Late at night, I'd scroll through Reddit, patient forums, and weird websites where people with similar symptoms were desperate for answers. Everything changed when my friend Michael, the ultimate tech geek who's always ahead of the curve, said to me, "Dude, have you tried GPT-O1 Pro?" I had no idea what that was. GPT sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie to me, but Michael explained it was some advanced AI that could analyze medical data. You upload your symptoms, test results, it spits out potential causes, treatment options, even articles from medical journals. "Mike, this sounds like a scam," I told him. "Maybe, but you've got nothing to lose, right?" And, well, he wasn't wrong. Of course, I didn't jump in right away. At first, I tried to find out if this thing even worked. I Googled, watched videos, read reviews, and the more I learned, the more this idea stuck in my head. If 32 doctors couldn't figure it out, what could I possibly lose by trying AI? Turns out things couldn't get worse, but they could get a whole lot better. After my conversation with Mike, I was still hesitant. Sure, AI sounded cool, but I wasn't some crazy conspiracy theorist ready to entrust my life to a machine. But a couple of weeks later, my symptoms got worse. Picture this. One moment, you're sitting calmly at your desk, and the next, your hands are shaking so badly you can barely hold a cup. That was my final signal. No more waiting. I called Mike. "Remember that? GPT-O1 Pro? Where can I get it?" "Well, it's not something you just download from the App Store," he said. "You have to sign up and fork out a hefty sum to access the full functionality. Officially, it's not available for public use yet, but if you want, I can ask a guy I know to get you access." It sounded a bit shady, like I was about to buy a fake passport, but honestly, at that point, nothing was stopping me. A few days later, Mike sent me a link, and I landed on this ultra-sleek website where every other term felt like tech jargon I couldn't understand. But the key part was clear. Access cost $10,000. $10,000. And that was just the basic package, folks. The full suite, including a complete analysis of all data and personalized recommendations, was $30,000. I stared at the screen, feeling my stomach tighten. Two thoughts ran through my head. 1. This is a total ripoff. 2. I've already spent over $100,000 in 3 years on doctors who still couldn't figure this out. In the end, I typed in my credit card info, paid for the ridiculously expensive premium package, and braced myself for the worst. A couple of hours later, I received my access, and I uploaded everything I had: test results, doctor's notes, x-rays, MRIs, basically anything I could cram into a folder. When I clicked Analyze, the AI began processing. On the screen, a progress bar appeared, and I stared at it without blinking as it crawled forward. Estimated processing time, 6 hours. What? I literally yelled out loud, but I had no other choice. Those 6 hours felt like an eternity. I sat there blankly staring at the wall, because no show or video game could distract me from the thought, what if this is just another pointless waste of money? When the progress bar finally hit 100%, I exhaled and opened the results. The first thing that caught my eye was the headline, Probable Causes, 7 Hypotheses Identified. 7. 7. And among them was something I'd never heard from any doctor. A rare autoimmune disease linked to an immune response targeting a specific protein. Below that was a massive explanation of the mechanism, plus a ton of links to studies and clinical case reports. I read it 3 times. Every word. All the way to the end. And you know what? It made sense. There was something there. Something the doctors had missed. This can't be real, I whispered. Or, can it? I called Mike. This is it. I think this is it. The next step was to confirm if the AI was right, but that turned out to be harder than I expected. When GPT-O1 Pro gave me its strange hypothesis about a rare autoimmune disease linked to an immune response to some protein, whose name I couldn't even pronounce without pausing, I felt like I'd found the key. But this was just the beginning, because now I had to find a doctor who would take it seriously. And, as it turned out, that was almost impossible. The first person I shared my findings with was Dr. Crawford, one of the top rheumatologists in Chicago. I booked an appointment with him despite the 2-month wait because he was considered a genius in his field. I sat across from him in his office, handed him the printed hypothesis from GPT-O1 Pro, and started explaining. This is data from an AI that analyzed my results. It describes a rare autoimmune condition and... He cut me off mid-sentence. Stop. Let me tell you what I think right away. I froze. These things, AI, web diagnosis, Google, they're dangerous. I understand your desperation, but medicine isn't about algorithms. It's about experience, observation, and science. His words sounded so confident that I almost believed him. Almost. But something inside me was boiling. With all due respect, doctor, this AI didn't just Google my symptoms. It analyzed hundreds of studies, compared them with my data, and proposed a hypothesis. You didn't even read it fully. He looked at me like I was one of those patients who believe in healing crystals. Then he sighed. Fine. I'll take a look. For 5 minutes, he silently studied the printout, tapping his fingers on the desk. Then he suddenly looked up. All right. This is interesting. But you realize it won't be easy to verify, right? Of course I realized that. It was the only thing I'd truly understood over the past 3 years. What followed was a nightmare of bureaucracy. Crawford suggested running additional tests to verify the hypothesis. But here was the catch. Most of those tests were rare and only available in a handful of labs across the country. And yes, they were expensive. The first test cost $4,500. The second, almost $6,000. And that didn't even include consultations or travel expenses. I wouldn't have been able to afford it if my family hadn't stepped in to help. When I told my parents everything, they didn't really understand what GPT-O1 Pro was, but they saw that I finally had a chance. Their support was what kept me going. Meanwhile, Crawford started taking the idea more seriously. As the first results started coming in, he became increasingly intrigued. This is unusual, he said one day, looking at my test results. Some markers do match this theory. I'm surprised. But it wasn't that simple. One of the key tests came back inconclusive, so we had to look for confirmation through other means. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. Either we'd prove the hypothesis, or I'd be back at square one, with no answers and even more debt. Then something happened that became a turning point. On one of the forums where I'd been sharing my story, a guy named Alex reached out to me. He said, I went through the same thing. It took me 5 years to get a diagnosis, but AI helped me back then. If you want, I can tell you how I convinced doctors to check my data. Alex became something of a mentor to me. He gave me a list of labs that could perform rare tests, explained how to prepare documents for insurance to request reimbursement, and even suggested contacting the doctor who had helped him. That doctor, Dr. Jenkins from Boston, ended up playing a key role in my treatment. When I got in touch with Dr. Jenkins in Boston, His approach immediately felt different. While most doctors had looked at me like I was a walking anomaly or questioned my sanity, Jenkins seemed to genuinely listen. He didn't interrupt, didn't roll his eyes, and didn't lecture me about trusting professionals over technology. "Tell me everything from the beginning," he said. I laid out the entire story of my struggle. The test results, the hypothesis from GPT-O1 Pro, even my own meticulous symptom log that I had been keeping for the past 3 years. He nodded quietly as he went through the documents. "This AI," he began, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I have to admit it's impressive. Not many patients come in with such a well-developed hypothesis. And yes, I see the logic here." I nearly broke down in tears right there in his office. After 3 years of running in circles, I was finally hearing words of validation from a doctor. Jenkins explained that some of the suggested tests could indeed shed light on my condition, but it wasn't as simple as walking into a lab and drawing blood. "We're talking about some fairly rare investigations," he said. "But if you're willing..." Was I willing? That wasn't even a question. The next 3 weeks were a whirlwind of hope, exhausting trips to clinics, and nerve-wracking waits for results. I had to fly to Maryland to take one specific test, and then to California for what was essentially an experimental procedure recommended by Jenkins. Meanwhile, the AI remained my guiding star. I kept cross-referencing hypotheses with GPT-O1 Pro, feeding it new data as it came in from the tests. And you know what? It didn't just stick to the same hypothesis. It adjusted its recommendations based on the updated results. One key moment came when GPT suggested focusing on my diet. It pointed out that certain autoimmune conditions could be exacerbated by foods containing specific proteins. Jenkins agreed to test this theory, and we set up a small experiment. For 2 weeks, I cut out everything on the list, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt better. Not dramatically, but noticeably. It was the first tangible sign that we were on the right track. The real breakthrough, however, came when the results of a crucial test from the Maryland lab arrived. That day, I got a call from Jenkins. "Hi," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "I've got news. Can you come in?" I flew to Boston the very next day. In his office, he laid the results out in front of me and said, "It all lines up. Your AI was right." I just sat there, staring at him, trying to process what I had just heard. "You have a rare form of autoimmune disease called..." He rattled off a long medical term that sounded like a spell from Harry Potter. "This doesn't mean you'll be cured tomorrow, but we finally know what we're dealing with." I couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in 3 years, I had an answer. When Jenkins told me the diagnosis was confirmed, it felt like coming up for air after being held underwater for years. But as it turned out, finding the cause wasn't the victory. It was just the beginning of a new battle. The diagnosis sounded like something straight out of a medical textbook. Hashimoto's syndrome, complicated by a rare variant of autoimmune encephalitis triggered by the GAD65 protein. Even Jenkins admitted he'd only encountered such a combination a couple of times in his career. "It's rare," he said, "but we know how to approach it." The AI gave us an excellent starting point. According to him, we needed to act fast. Start therapy to calm my overactive immune system, stabilize my hormones, and try to minimize the damage that had already been done. It all sounded promising, but I couldn't shake the thought, what if something goes wrong? The treatment began with a cocktail of medications: steroids to suppress immune activity, hormones to support my thyroid, and a specialized diet to eliminate triggers. It was an intricate system, and every step required fine-tuning. Jenkins coordinated everything with a team of dietitians, neurologists, and endocrinologists. Each week, I returned to the clinic to have my blood tested and monitor how my body was responding. And surprisingly, the changes began almost immediately. "Have you noticed the tremors have lessened?" Jenkins asked me during one of our appointments. I froze. "Yes," I replied. "But I thought it was a coincidence." He nodded. "It's not a coincidence. Your inflammation markers are going down. That's a good sign." Still, it wasn't easy. The side effects of the treatment sometimes felt worse than the symptoms themselves. The steroids caused insomnia, the injections left bruises, and cutting out familiar foods made every grocery trip a test of patience. But at that point, I was willing to endure anything to claw my way out of this nightmare. There was one evening I remember vividly. I was sitting in the kitchen with Mike, who had dropped by to check on me. We were eating some gluten-free crackers so bland I couldn't fathom why anyone would willingly buy them. "Still," he said, "you should be proud. You found the answer. Even the doctors couldn't do that, but you did." I looked at him. "It wasn't me. It was GPT. Yeah, but who ran it?" He grinned. "You could have just given up." Those words stuck with me. I really could have. I could have stayed trapped in that endless loop of doctors who looked at me as a statistic, not a person. But I didn't give up. Over the following months, I learned how to live with the diagnosis. The symptoms became less frequent, and on the days when they did flare up, I reminded myself that I now knew how to fight them. But the most surprising thing? Jenkins started using GPT-O1 Pro in his own practice. "This changes the game," he told me one day. "It doesn't replace doctors, of course, but as a tool for analyzing complex cases, it's revolutionary." He even asked me to speak at a medical seminar to share my story. I agreed, though I felt a little out of place. I wasn't a doctor, just a person who refused to stop searching for answers. My story, as strange as it sounds, began to take on a life of its own. After speaking at the seminar organized by Jenkins, I unexpectedly found myself at the center of attention. People approached me, asked questions, and scribbled notes in their notepads. One young doctor said enthusiastically, "This sounds like the plot for a documentary. You have no idea how important this is for medicine." The next day, Jenkins texted me, "Get ready. This is just the beginning." And he was right. A week later, I got a call from a reporter at a small medical journal. They wanted to publish an article about how I had used GPT-O1 Pro to diagnose my condition. I agreed, thinking it would remain something niche, but the article quickly went viral within the medical community. Then I received an email from a group of researchers at MIT. They were studying the use of AI in diagnostics and wanted me to be part of their pilot project. "Your case is unique," wrote lead researcher Dr. Julian Carter. "It demonstrates how AI can become a real tool in diagnosing complex diseases. We'd like to study this process more deeply." Meeting them in Cambridge felt like stepping into a scene from a science fiction movie. Glass walls, screens displaying endless streams of data, teams of people analyzing massive data sets. They seated me in a conference room and asked me to tell my story from the very beginning. Dr. Carter listened intently, then asked me a question that completely threw me off. "Why do you think doctors missed what the AI was able to find?" I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to blame the doctors. They're human, not robots. But after a moment of thought, I said, "I think doctors are just overwhelmed. They have to see dozens of patients a day, and they can't dive deeply into every case. AI doesn't get tired. It just analyzes data." Carter nodded. "That's precisely why we're trying to integrate these technologies into clinical practice. But the problem is, many doctors don't trust AI. They're afraid it will replace them." I thought of Dr. Crawford and his skepticism. Yeah, that sounded familiar. MIT proposed an experiment. Take a group of patients with unclear diagnoses, load their data into GPT-O1 Pro, and compare the results with traditional diagnostic methods. And guess who they invited as an expert patient? My role was to help explain what it felt like from the patient's perspective. The desperation, the mistrust, the attempt to find answers in the most unlikely places. I became a sort of bridge between technology and real life. The results of the experiment stunned everyone. Out of 20 complex cases, the AI was able to propose accurate hypotheses in 15. That was far more than the doctors had expected. But the most powerful moment for me came during the speech of one of the participants, Emily, who also found her diagnosis after years of searching, thanks to GPT. She said, "If I had known about this tool earlier, I would have saved myself years of pain and loneliness." Her words hit me deeply because I knew exactly what it was like to be in her shoes. This project turned me into a sort of ambassador for AI in medicine. Over the next year, I traveled to conferences, gave presentations, and even appeared in a small documentary about technology and healthcare. But honestly, all the attention felt strange to me. I was just someone trying to survive. All I ever wanted was to stop waking up every morning in uncertainty. After all the conferences, research, and interviews, my life began to feel surreal. A few years ago, I was sitting in yet another waiting room, wondering if everything was just in my head. And now I was standing on stages, speaking to rooms full of doctors, scientists, and people developing technologies that could transform medicine. But inside, I was still just a regular person who wanted to return to a normal life. My new normal involved regular checkups with Jenkins, periodic health monitoring, and the endless adjustments to the diet and lifestyle that kept my condition under control. Sometimes it was hard. Sometimes I wanted to give up. One evening I was at home, surrounded by notes filled with calorie counts and lists of foods I could eat. I was trying to put together something resembling dinner when Mike showed up unannounced with a box of pizza. "You look like the star of a survival documentary," he said. I laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Sometimes it feels like I'm stuck in that movie," I replied. Mike sat across from me and put the pizza aside. "Do you still think it wasn't worth it?" "I think it's been hard," I said, staring thoughtfully at the list in my hand. "But I'm glad I know what's wrong with me now. It's just, sometimes I feel like this illness took everything from me. My habits, my freedom, even the food I love." He shook his head. "It took a lot, but man, you beat it. You're living with it, and you gave other people a chance. Isn't that incredible?" Those words stuck with me. They didn't make everything easier, but they made me see things differently. My work with MIT was still ongoing. At one point, they asked me to test an updated version of GPT-O1 Pro, specifically tuned for medical diagnostics. This time, it was far more personalized. The AI could account not just for test results, but for daily symptoms recorded by the patient. I started using this version as my personal doctor. For example, if I woke up with a headache or felt unusually tired, I entered the data into the system. GPT-O1 Pro didn't just give general advice, it provided detailed recommendations. Try reducing iodine in your diet. Your tests indicate it might be a trigger, the system suggested one day. I gave it a try, and within a week, I noticed a real difference. That was the moment I realized this tool had become my ally. Not a replacement for doctors, but something that made my life easier and gave me a sense of control. At some point, my story reached a broader audience. A major tech company contacted me to ask if I would become the face of their campaign to promote AI in medicine. Honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. But then they explained their goal, to show how technology could help ordinary people who feel lost in the healthcare system. And so, a few months later, I found myself on screen, telling my story. 3 years of struggle, 30 hospitals, $100,000 spent, and the despair that almost made me give up. The response was overwhelming. People began reaching out on social media, sharing similar stories, and asking how they could use GPT-O1 Pro. But the most meaningful moment came when I received a message from someone named Jason. He lived in a small town in the southern US. Jason wrote, "Hi, I read your story and decided to try using AI for my daughter. She had strange symptoms no one could explain. Because of your advice, we discovered she has a rare metabolic syndrome. You saved her. Thank you." I sat staring at the screen, feeling tears well up in my eyes. It was a strange feeling, fighting for your own life, only to realize that your struggle had saved someone else. After that message from Jason, something clicked inside me. For the first time, I truly felt that everything I'd gone through had a purpose, not just for me, but for someone else. I started replying to the messages from people who found me through social media. Their stories were eerily similar to mine. Years of undiagnosed symptoms, countless doctors who couldn't provide answers, and the overwhelming feeling of fighting alone. Every letter I read made me want to do more. I couldn't just sit back and watch as people drowned in the same system that had nearly swallowed me whole. One day, I received a message from Dr. Carter at MIT. "We have an idea. We want to develop a version of GPT that's affordable and accessible to patients. We need someone like you to help us understand what people truly need. It sounded ambitious, maybe even too ambitious. But if anyone could pull it off, it was Carter and his team. We began working on a project we called Patient Ally, a simplified version of GPT-O1 Pro designed for everyday people. The system wouldn't just analyze symptoms, it would help users formulate the right questions to ask doctors and even suggest lifestyle changes and dietary adjustments based on their data. You'll need to be the face of the project, Carter told me during one of our calls. You're someone who's lived through this. You can explain why it matters. Even though the idea of being in the spotlight still felt strange to me, I agreed. The project gained momentum. We started testing the system with small groups of users. One of the first was a woman named Sarah, a mother of 3 who had been struggling with chronic fatigue and joint pain for 5 years. When she tried Patient Ally, the system suggested she check her vitamin D levels and test for rheumatoid arthritis. It turned out she did, in fact, have autoimmune arthritis, something that no one had diagnosed before. I met her at one of the events where we were showcasing the project. She approached me and hugged me, saying, "I thought I'd have to live with this for the rest of my life. You changed my life." Those words felt like they were permanently etched into my memory, but not everything went smoothly. As the project began to attract attention, a wave of criticism followed. Some doctors argued that technologies like this could give patients a false sense of security, or worse, spread unnecessary panic. I faced this criticism head-on during a discussion with a group of doctors. One of them, an elderly endocrinologist named Dr. Henderson, said, "You're risking the integrity of our profession. People will start relying on machines instead of coming to specialists." I sighed and replied, "Sir, I understand your concerns, but this technology isn't a replacement for doctors. It's a tool that helps us feel less lost. It helps us prepare, ask the right questions. Without it, I might never have found my diagnosis." Henderson didn't look convinced, but other doctors nodded in agreement. The conversations were tough, but I realized they were part of the process. If you want to change the system, you have to be ready to stand up for your beliefs. Meanwhile, the Patient Ally project kept growing. We launched a beta version of the app, and it immediately attracted thousands of users. People began sharing their stories online, talking about how the system had helped them or their loved ones. It became more than just a project for me. It was a movement. We weren't just building a technology, we were creating a community of people who finally felt empowered to take control of their lives. But along with that came an important realization. No matter how good the technology is, it will always need people who are willing to fight for themselves. The beta version of Patient Ally was like a speeding train. Thousands of downloads, dozens of early diagnosis successes, and more stories from people thanking us for finally giving them answers. I should have been happy. But serious obstacles began to loom on the horizon. One morning, I opened my email and froze. There was a request for an interview from a major news agency. They wanted to learn more about the project, but the tone of the email was, to put it mildly, cautious. "Some experts claim that using systems like these can harm patients. We'd like to hear your response." I realized that a controversy was brewing around the project. More people were beginning to ask questions. What happens if the AI makes a mistake? Who is responsible for such errors? My mind was swirling with contradictions. I knew Patient Ally was helping people. I had seen it with my own eyes. But what if one AI mistake led to a disaster? The next day, I was invited to a debate. It was a kind of medical summit, where leading doctors, AI developers, and media representatives had gathered. The topic sounded ominous. AI in medicine, salvation or threat? On stage before me sat a panel of experts with long titles, including Dr. Henderson, who had already criticized me once before. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, clutching a sheet of notes in my hand, and looked out at the audience. "I'm not here as a programmer or a doctor," I began. "I'm here as a person who spent 3 years searching for an answer, and I didn't find it in hospitals or clinics. I found it thanks to a technology that saw what doctors couldn't." I paused, feeling my hands start to tremble. "But I don't want you to think I'm against doctors. On the contrary, Doctors are heroes who fight for us every day, but let's admit it. They're not omnipotent. The system is overwhelmed, resources are limited. AI isn't a threat. It's an aid. It's a tool that can give doctors more time and patients more hope. My speech was met with applause, but I noticed that Henderson looked displeased. All of this sounds very nice, he said when the microphone was passed to him. But you're talking about isolated success stories. Who will take responsibility when the system makes a mistake? When AI leads to a misdiagnosis? His question felt like a punch to the gut. It was the very fear that kept me awake at night. I took the microphone and replied, "You're right, Doctor. Henderson, we have to be prepared for the possibility of mistakes. But are they not possible in traditional medicine? How many people like me were left undiagnosed for years? The difference is that AI can be improved. It learns. We all learn. And instead of fearing change, we should work together to make this system better." It was a risky move, but I felt the audience lean in my favor. After the debate, I stepped outside to catch my breath. A young woman, one of the event organizers, approached me. "You did great," she said with a smile. "Honestly, I use Patient Ally too. It helped my mom figure out she had a thyroid issue." Those words brought my confidence back. Meanwhile, internal conflicts were brewing within the project. Some investors didn't like how much time we were spending on making the system accessible. "We need to focus on clinics and paid services," one of them said during a meeting. "Mass market appeal sounds nice, but it doesn't make money." I felt myself starting to boil over. "Money?" I repeated, staring directly at him. From the beginning, this project has been about people who can't afford $500 consultations. It's for those who were abandoned by the system. And now you want to turn it into just another product for the wealthy? The room went silent. Dr. Carter later told me that this was the moment the investors realized I wasn't just the face of the project. I was its moral compass. But the conflict made me question myself. What if I was heading in the wrong direction? What if I was losing control of what I had started? That night, I called Mike and unloaded everything that was weighing on my mind. "You can't make everything perfect," he said, "but you've already done more than most people do in a lifetime. And dude, you've changed someone's life. Isn't that enough?" I couldn't answer right away. But deep down I knew he was right. Sometimes life brings you to a moment where you must make a choice that changes everything. For me, that moment came a few months after the conflict with the investors nearly destroyed everything we had built. Patient Ally was growing and evolving, but the tension surrounding the project continued to build. The investors pressured Carter's team to turn the system into a premium service available only to paid clinics. Jenkins, my doctor and longtime ally, tried to reason with me. "They're right about one thing. For the project to be sustainable, it has to generate profit. Free technology doesn't last long." It sounded reasonable, but I couldn't forget Jason's letter, Sarah's words, and all the stories of people we had helped. How could I make this inaccessible to those who needed it most? I felt like I was losing my mind under the pressure. Everything changed when a journalist who had previously interviewed me called. "You need to know something," he began. "There are rumors that some big pharmaceutical companies are putting pressure on your investors. They're worried that Patient Ally is too accessible." I was stunned. "Are you saying they're afraid of competition?" I asked. "Exactly. If the system helps people diagnose themselves earlier, it could hurt their business. You need to be careful." That was the moment I realized this was no longer just about my health or the project. It was a fight for access to knowledge and people's right to understand their own bodies. At the next meeting with the investors, I felt I could no longer stay silent. "You want to monetize this and make it accessible only to the wealthy," I said, looking at everyone seated around the long glass table. "But how does that help the people who can't afford such a luxury? We set out to change the system, not become a part of it." One investor, a middle-aged man with a smug expression, rolled his eyes. "And how do you propose to pay for development if no one is paying? Volunteers?" I took a deep breath. But there are other ways. Subsidies, non-profit partnerships. We can find support if we look beyond profit. At that moment, Carter backed me up. I agree with him. If we turn this into a premium product, it will destroy everything we've worked for. If you don't like that, you're welcome to leave the project. I had never seen Carter so resolute. Several investors left after that. We lost nearly half our funding, but we preserved something far more important: our mission. The new challenges forced us to think outside the box. We launched a crowdfunding campaign where I shared my story. We also partnered with nonprofit organizations that supported the idea of accessible medical technology. The results exceeded all expectations. People donated, shared the project on social media, and wrote about their own experiences. Every new message or contribution confirmed that we had made the right choice. One evening, I was at home sorting through emails when I received another message. This time, it was from a young doctor at a rural clinic in Kansas. "I'm using Patient Ally to help my patients, and it's incredible. We're catching things I never would have noticed due to a lack of time and resources. Thank you for continuing to fight for this project." Those words meant more to me than any award ever could. Today, Patient Ally operates worldwide. It's not a perfect system, and it will never replace doctors. But it's a powerful tool that helps people feel that their health is their right, not a privilege. My life has changed forever. My autoimmune diagnosis no longer defines who I am. It's part of my story, but not the end of it. I've learned something important. Sometimes, the pain and struggles you go through become the tools for something greater. If you're reading this and feel lost, know this: the answers are out there. They may not come right away, but never stop searching. Sometimes, technology, human kindness, and a little persistence can change your life. Thank you for being part of my story. Now it's your turn to write yours.